All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Aaron Leffland, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. For those that might be newer to CLCC, we are the statewide umbrella organization for Connecticut's land trusts, and we support your work through advocacy, funding, technical assistance, and programs like this one. Today, we're talking about collaboration pathways for land trusts. And often, when people hear collaboration, they might think, does that mean merger or does that mean giving something up? But that's not really the point of today's conversation. The point is that collaboration exists on a broad spectrum. Sometimes it's as simple as sharing information with neighboring land trusts. Sometimes it means sharing staff, services, or expertise. Sometimes it means building more formal partnerships. And in some cases, it may mean merger. The goal for today is to help land trusts understand the range of options that are available and to think clearly about what tools might help them meet the moment they're in. The reality is that many land trusts across Connecticut are facing similar pressures. Stewardship responsibilities are growing, boards and volunteers are thinking about succession, fundraising is becoming challenging, and the work itself is becoming more complex with increasing needs around climate resilience, habitat connectivity, regional planning, community engagement, and long-term management of the lands that we've protected. And at the same time, Connecticut's land trusts remain deeply rooted in their local communities, and that local identity is one of the greatest strengths of our movement. So the question we're exploring today is not how do we give that up? The question is how can land trusts stay rooted locally while building while building the capacity to do more and to do it well over the long term. Today's webinar is based on a new guide from CLCC called Land Trust Collaboration Pathways, which provides an overview of collaboration options for Connecticut's land trusts, from informal coordination to deeper structural partnerships. That guide is actually a distilled version of a much more detailed body of research that was developed for CLCC's use by today's presenter, Dan Salazar. Dan did a tremendous amount of work looking at collaboration and governance models, and today's presentation draws directly from that research. Dan was CLCC's 2025 Encore Fellow and brings more than 25 years of experience in sustainable and inclusive development, strategy, and project implementation, and partnership building across the nonprofit, public, and private sectors. His background includes work with the World Bank, UN agencies, MasterCard, and nonprofit organizations. He also holds advanced degrees in agricultural and resource economics and has served on the board of Real Food Connecticut, which is a farm to pantry security organization based in Newtown. We're very grateful for Dan for bringing that experience to CLCC and for helping us think through these questions in a thoughtful and practical way. Before I turn things over, just a few quick housekeeping notes about today's presentation. We are using Zoom webinar today, which is a little bit different than Zoom meetings that you might be used to. The main difference is that only presenters can come on screen and unmute themselves. But we do want this to be interactive, and there is a question and answer function built into Zoom webinar, which you should see on the bottom of your screen. And you can use that to submit questions as they come to mind, and we'll be sure to save some time at the end for review of those questions and discussion and answers. Depending on where they fit into the presentation, we might answer a couple along the way. So whenever a question comes up, feel free to just pop that into the Q&A feature. Lastly, this session is being recorded, and we'll share this recording afterwards. And finally, a quick but important note, today's presentation and the accompanying guide are intended for planning and discussion purposes. We don't provide legal or tax advice, and these should not be considered such. So for any land trust considering any formal collaboration structure, you should seek legal and financial counsel of your own. So with all of that said, I'm very pleased to turn things over to Dan to kick us off.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to and present this webinar. If you want to go to the first slide, our overview slide, that would be a good start. And as Aaron has mentioned or said, we're going to talk about how to collaborate. But before we do that, let's just back up a minute and talk about why collaborate. And a couple of the points that Aaron made and that I'd like to reinforce and make are the fact that Connecticut's land trusts vary widely in size, capacity, and their geographic footprints. Yet many are facing similar challenges: stewardship workload, board succession, fundraising pressures, and the need for specialized expertise. And at the same time, these land trusts are being asked to respond to increasingly complex issues, from habitat connectivity and climate resilience to regional conservation planning. So these trends create a need for increased scale, corresponding efficiencies, and in some cases, specialization, the ability to carry on new and specialized functions, among others. Uh, these capabilities and outcomes can be facilitated by collaboration between land trusts as well as with other environmentally focused organizations. So in summary, there's a number of compelling reasons to collaborate. So we now segue, so to speak, into let's look at how to collaborate. And while merger between organizations is an option, there are reasons why it may not be necessary nor desirable. We need to bear in mind that collaboration is not a one size fits all proposition. In fact, there are many opportunities to collaborate that don't require organizations to merge. Land trust can work in various ways, from informal coordination at one end of the spectrum to more formal shared structures or models, each with different implications around legal form governance at risk at the other end of the spectrum. Before I move on, I just want to hand it off to Aaron and see if he has anything else to add to collaboration.
Yeah, it's a great intro, Dan. And the only thing I'll add is just sort of reiterating that one size doesn't fit all approach, and that CLCC is here to support land trusts through different means of collaboration. I'm sure many of you have attended some of the regional gatherings that we've hosted or some of the peer networking programs that we've hosted. And so we are interested in supporting all of the different types of partnerships that you'll hear about through today's presentation, and hope you'll get in touch with us if some of these pique your interest.
So with that said, Aaron, why don't we move to the next slide? And here I'd like to discuss once again a little bit more about the why before we move on to the how. But essentially, let's touch on some of the motivations for collaboration. And I can provide three different examples. The first being the shared stewardship and land management. In this case, several land trusts may come together to collaborate to co-manage land or connected properties. They can do so by pooling the representative expertise, equipment, and volunteers. Examples include coordinated management activities, the shared use of staff. Another case for collaboration may be efforts to jointly, where land trusts can come together to jointly acquire, hold, or manage conservation easements. Acquire land, hold land, and manage the conservation easements. An example of this, a recent example of this is Tanner Farm, which was a collaboration with between the Warren Land Trust and the Northwest Connecticut Land Conservancy, which enabled the protection of both agricultural and ecological resources that would likely have exceeded the ability and capacity of any single of these organizations to execute this effort. They brought, in this case, unique resources to the table through the collaborative effort. Warren Land Trust provided local relationships, project leadership, and long-term stewardship capacity, while NCLC contributed regional agricultural conservation expertise and capacity to acquire and administer the farmland easement. Um, and then a third reason or third opportunity, and it's one that I feel that I've come to learn is that many land trusts are challenged with, especially smaller volunteer-led organizations, is servicing key services that they may need, and this is an opportunity for land trusts to enter into collaborations. Uh, whether they be a contract, a joint venture, or an affiliate, which we'll talk about more later in the presentation. But with a smaller land trust to work with a larger land trust to acquire uh, necessary staffing, administrative, or specialized services that they might need. Um, and this helps to professionalize operations, and examples of this can include pooled back office support um, or shared staffing, amongst others. Um, and having laid out and described, you know, in this case, three examples of why land trusts should collaborate in some issues and opportunities addressed. Let's move on to the next slide so that we can talk about how to collaborate, how land trusts can collaborate by looking at several models, or we might refer to this as a continuum, so to speak, of collaborative structures. And we have four models that are we're going to talk about. They range from on the left-hand side to information sharing, which is completely where land trusts are completely independent and autonomous. And then as you move towards the right, at the other end of the spectrum, a corporate affiliation, which it represents a much tighter integration between the collaborating organizations. And this spectrum and the implications uh, are important to understand. They have their own unique characteristics, and they're applicable to different unique situations. So let's begin by talking about information sharing. Um, in this case, in this collaborative model, organizations with shared visions and objectives can share information to advance their missions. There's no formal commitments or obligations, but interactions may be conditioned on a confidentiality agreement. Um, this collaborative structure is good for building relationships. It's a good early stage effort for coordination and trust building. It allows land trusts to explore and understand each other. Now, as you move towards more integration, more formalized structure, you go to a contractual collaboration. And like the name implies, it's a contract. It's a project agreement. Uh, it's the it's the on-ramp for deeper partnership, yet it's light enough for the parties involved to reverse, to pull out. It involves limited risk, and it characterized by minimal shared governance. It's appropriate for short-term and project-specific activities. It can be used for joint programming, sharing specialists, co-branded efforts, or project-based work. Now, as we move further to more increased integration, we have the model, the archetype that we'll describe that is a joint venture. And in a joint venture, the effort is jointly owned or governed and managed by either a shared board or a steering committee. Joint efforts allow land trusts to achieve certain programmatic goals, it goes beyond the transactional cooperation of a contract by supporting operational interdependence. Decision making is shared by the participating organizations. They contribute resources, and these resources are pooled, including key assets and financial risks, assets, and it's a longer term or more indefinite collaboration than would be a contractual arrangement. Um, it's best for shared services, regional stewardship, or long-term collaborative programs. And it really is a step up in the integration. And before I move to the last model, which is a further integration of activities among land trusts, I'd just like to point out that critical to all these efforts is trust between organizations. And trust goes a long way. And the point I would make is that the trust will only go so far in that there comes a point where organizations need to move beyond trust-based and informal collaboration as they take on more complex undertakings. And so you can think about these as those opportunities to take on the more complex undertakings and how you would do that. And then the last model is a corporate affiliation. So in a corporate affiliation, there's a need for sustained integration between land trusts of both their governance and their operations. Think of it as a unitary structure, a parent and a child, uh, a partner's viability or the program continuity depends on the other. Organizations are formally linked through the government's documents and distinct rights and responsibilities of the parent organization. It's best suited for sustained integration, those cases where there are risks to be managed, as well as preserving the local identity of a land trust that's working, say, with a larger parent, a larger organization to professionalize it or seek support services. So I've laid out this continuum. The characteristics of the continuum are going, so to speak, from complete autonomy to more robust integration of efforts between land trusts as you move as you step across the spectrum of opportunities. So I will um, move on now to the next slide.
And
Uh,
just before we do, we had because the rest of this presentation is really going to focus on joint ventures and corporate affiliation. I do want to take time just to answer one question that came in through the chat. Joeen asked if there are examples of contractual collaboration, and I don't think that's something we incorporated later in the slide. So I thought I would just quickly lay out a few examples of that before we move on. Um,
I would add actually that in the introduction or a couple slides back when I talked about joint acquisition
mhm.
and we talked about Tanner Farm. Um, if you dig into that, Tanner Farm is an example of a contractual collaboration. I mean, that could have been executed as a joint venture easily, but I think there was probably a fair amount of robust working relationships and goodwill between the two organizations, and they were able to define the margins, the contributions, and manage the effort in such a way that the contractual collaboration model worked for them.
Yeah, so I think acquisitions is one really concrete example of where contracts might be a collaborative model. Some other examples that come to mind, Joeen, include we have some land trusts that are sharing staff, and so they have a contract laid out about how much time that staff member is going to spend with each organization, how much money each organization contributes to support that position, where the oversight and HR considerations lie. And I think other examples, in some cases, there are more formal arrangements with groups like regional conservation partnerships, where the partners actually kind of sign on and have a partner agreement letter, which is sort of a light form of a contract. So yeah, anytime there needs to be something written down to really formalize the process is what we're sort of talking about through this contractual collaboration. Um, Dan, anything to add there?
No.
Okay. And then I'll do one other question here. Um, Again, since we have the sort of spectrum or continuum up on the page here, the question is, do you suggest that land trusts that are interested in merging go through these steps as part of the trust building process? Um, I can take a quick stab at that. I think the the earlier things on this spectrum, absolutely. Information sharing, contractual collaboration, working with a potential merger partner through those sorts of things makes a lot of sense. We'll talk about this a bit later, but the joint venture and corporate affiliation models that we're talking about require a lot of work. And so if your end goal is merger, you might be putting yourself through a lot of extra hoops to get to a point where you're ready to merge, and that might be accomplished by just sort of building that trust through information sharing and through contractual collaboration. Dan, I don't know if you have anything to add on that before we move on.
I mean, the only point I would make is that trust and goodwill are important enablers, and each situation is unique. And to your point, the ultimate goal is merger. You don't need to necessarily progress through all the steps.
Perfect. All right.
So, let's take a different view and summarize some of the key dimensions of these collaborative arrangements. And while these are high-level dimensions, let's recognize that there's variation in how they may actually be executed in specific circumstances. So we've talked about information sharing, voluntary collaboration towards a shared purpose and goal, trust, good relationships. The legal form is informal. It's potentially confidential. There might be an MOU or a partner agreement. Governance is informal. Decision making, which is critical, is general consensus. And the financial exposure is limited to the independent efforts of the parties. Next, we move on to contractual. This is transactional cooperation. It's joint programming, as we've talked, shared staff. This is an MOU or a specific service contract. Once again, it's informal, but there's informal coordination. The decision making is independent, but it's project specific. And the financial exposure in this case is limited to the scope of the contract. Um, and now we move to a joint venture, which goes beyond the transactional cooperation of a contract. And there's a need for to recognize the operational interdependence of the organizations. In this case, there can be a joint, the legal form can be a joint venture agreement, a shared LLC, um, which, in other words, is a creation of a new jointly governed entity. Um, Governance could be a joint steering committee or a board. Decision making is through shared oversight and mutual consent. And the financial exposure exists around the contribution of resources to the venture, uh, such as uh, assets, shared assets, or liabilities. And then finally, um, the corporate affiliation goes beyond the joint venture and recognizes the sustained integration of governance, brand, and operations. This interdependence is likely necessary for the viability of the involved organizations. Um, we'll talk about this in more detail, but there's the legal form. There's some variations here. There's a parent-child or a parent subsidiary, um, in which the parent sole serves as the sole member of the subsidiary. Um, but there's also an umbrella charter. Um, this organizational form strives for unified governance in the parent subsidiary relationship or a cross-appointed board in an umbrella structure. But decision making is integrated, there's unified leadership. And then finally, from the financial exposure perspective, uh, exposure is consolidated and it is centrally managed. And as we talk about these elements of collaboration, I would point out that as the services being provided in an arrangement are becoming more complex, or the assets involved are more intangible, or things are just harder to define, say through their detailing in a contract, there comes a need for more structured governance. And this governance should be structured in a way that minimizes the costs of writing, monitoring, and enforcing the underlying agreement, the agreement underlying the initiatives. So let's now move on to the next slide and focus on some of the variations of the joint venture and affiliation model. Um, these these variations represent some of the examples that we've observed. It's robust. I would say though that it's not comprehensive. There may be a couple that we've missed, but I think overall it's a fair characterization of kind of the nuances involved. On the joint venture side, we have uh, two nonprofits collaborating to scale stewardship or regional coordination. Um, the next model is a multi-partner umbrella where multiple entities can come together, NGOs, governments, to across the landscape or a watershed to create a hub, a unique platform for the members of the efforts of the members. You have cases of nonprofits working with governments. You have nonprofits working with private investors, ventures between uh, a nonprofit that's seeking conservation goals and a private investor that's seeking financial return. A simple example might be some cases of housing developments, as an example. And then the final model that we observed is a fiscal sponsorship where a land trust is hosting a mission-aligned project. Think of an education center or a farm incubator that's operating semi-independently, but it's leveraging the land trust's fiscal and legal umbrella. And I would add that I had come to learn that this was the model that launched CLCC years ago. CLCC was working under the sponsorship of another land trust before it finally established itself as an independent entity. So these are, so to speak, the joint venture models. And then we move to the more integrated corporate affiliation models, three in particular, an umbrella trust, where a parent is coordinating multiple subsidiaries in a target area, a one-way support organization, where is an affiliation that separates activities from the main parent organization. And think about almost establishing a hands-off organization that can house potential liabilities or risks. Um, and then the third example being a subsidiary operational arm where you don't want you want a support organization, you want a relationship, say, to handle complex transactions through a wholly owned unit or subsidiary. And in this case, you're not looking for the hands off. It's more what's more important to you is the alignment and integration of the two organizations. Uh, while not discussed in detail here, there's two others. A for-profit mission enterprise. So I think of this as a subsidiary that's selling carbon credits, or there's some for-profit aspect to its activities, but for governance reasons, you want to keep the two entities formally separate. And then a pre-merger affiliation you can think of as a smaller land trust is seeking to strengthen its capacities, and it affiliates with a larger land trust that's able to provide services that help it to professionalize its operations. And I'll stop there. Any comments, Aaron, or should we keep going forward?
I think we're good. No questions have come up yet, so
Oh,
let's keep going.
okay. So so the purpose kind of going forward from this point is having laid the landscape and addressed the different organizational forms at a high level and laid out some of the variations. We wanted to drill a little bit deeper into the joint venture model, which is a good fit when land trusts want to work together in a more formal way without merging. It sits in the middle of the spectrum. It's more structured than a contract, but less integrated than an affiliation. And it can help land trusts to share a responsibility for a program, a service, an initiative, yet allow each of the organizations to remain independent. And we had highlighted on the previous page two or more nonprofits working together to create a formal shared effort to deliver a program, service, or initiative. This is the left-hand column, the nonprofit. And the legal structure could be a joint operating agreement between two existing entities, a federation, so to speak, that establishes a contractual joint venture. But the collaboration in this case could actually take an additional step to create a new entity. But that will be discussed on the example on the right. In this case, the governance is executed by a joint steering committee, and financial responsibility is allocated contractually. Um, so to speak, some of the risks here, though, is that without a distinct entity, uh, there is a potential for deadlock, maybe the lack of a clear dispute resolution mechanism, and ownership and liabilities, uh, i.e., governance control, might get a little bit murky. Um, a multi-partner umbrella or consortium, on the other hand, on the right-hand side, think of multiple organizations coming together to create an umbrella organization that coordinates conservation activities uh, across a landscape or a watershed. Uh, the organizations can shape their priorities through a representative governance structure. In this case, it's a unique, a new 501c3 that's been established. Um, and that 501c3 is governed by bylaws, partner agreements, founding documents that define the different roles of the affiliated members. It's On a downside, it may become it may slow the pace of decision making down a bit, as that it's relies on consensus building. It can dilute accountability, and as well as the fact that each member retains the autonomy over their own assets. And we're going to actually we have a case study to describe that on the next slide. It's the Cape Cod Compact, uh, which was founded as a non-profit service hub by 6 land trusts to provide technical assistance. It's grown to 24 trusts and watershed groups across the Cape, and it offers shared expertise in land transactions, stewardship, ecology, fundraising, and nonprofit administration. Um, the governance is through a separate 501(c)(3) that's been established, not a federation or the less formal version, but a new entity. An MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, defines the scope of the services and the cost sharing. And then the board is comprised of members representing the member land trusts, and they oversee policy, budget, personnel. And the great thing about this is it's allowed land trusts a lot of the members, a lot of which are volunteer driven, to take on more work and more ambitious projects. Um, it But on the downside, the compact, it's a complex arrangement. Um, there's diffuse accountability, and ultimately the compact bears liability for the provision of services, problems associated with its provision of services. Um, and finally, it's reliant on member dues and service fees for its sustainability. Okay, so now we move on to the most integrative collaborative approach, the affiliate model, a deeper form of collaboration. Organizations remain legally separate, but the entities are linked through governance, control, and formal organizational relationships. For land trusts, these models can support long-term collaborations, shared systems, and stronger operational capacity while at the same time preserving local identity. Um, we talk about, or here we present 3, so to speak, different variations on the model that I had earlier highlighted. The umbrella, so to speak, the umbrella organization, the one-way support organization, and then the subsidiary conservation operating arm. And if we look at the umbrella, we see that in this case, it coordinates multiple affiliates in the target area or region. Affiliated smaller land, it can affiliate smaller land trusts, for example, under a stronger regional structure. Um, and in this case, the umbrella is the central organization. It's established, so to speak, as a holding nonprofit with multiple subsidiaries or affiliated trusts. Um, but what's important here from a governance perspective, it's a single governance, a unitary governance. It's integrated and it defines the representation from each affiliate, the voting rights, the resource allocation, and oversight. But it allows local or affiliated organizations to operate as separate entities, often with their own boards or advisory boards. Um, and it puts forth for the affiliated organizations, the board, the governance does, shared policies, systems, and standards to help align operations across the network. Um, the risks is it can be complex. There may be transparency challenges, and there can be a concentration of power. If we move to the one-way support organization, which I had mentioned earlier, um, this is an entity or a separate structure that's organized to support a land trust. It can, for example, it can house uh, different risk profile assets, operations with different risk profiles or operating needs. It is a mechanism to separate, so to speak, reputational or liability risks. And it does so by establishing two separate entities with a formal agreement. The key being to separate the organizations. So there may be, from a governance perspective, there may be some board overlap, but that needs to be minimized because one of the risks here is for regulators to not see the organizations as two distinct entities, and really that is the goal of the structure, is to have that for the affiliated organizations to be recognized as distinct. Um, so one way from a governance perspective is to minimize overlap, but the parent would still would appoint directors to the affiliated organization. Um, it's complicated. There's some governance ambiguity, and another risk may be, so to speak, the possibility of reputational and liability spillover that it's meant to address. Um, and then the third affiliated structure that we'd like to highlight as a mechanism for collaboration is a subsidiary conservation operating arm. So a land trust creates or controls a separate entity to carry out specific functions. Um, and this might be to facilitate complex real estate transactions, to hold or manage properties with elevated risk, um, a specialized arm for unique activities, which might include farm management or habitat restoration. From a legal structure perspective, the parent owns, or better said, controls all interest in the subsidiary, um, but the subsidiary may have its own board, which is often populated by members of the parent board. Um, from a governance perspective, the parent nonprofit owns or controls all the membership or voting interest in the subsidiary. The subsidiary board may have limited autonomy uh, and heed the parent's oversight, but it's still technically independent. Um, and the parent may incorporate into governance for critical issues to the parent, issues reflecting on its viability or image, reserve rights, which are rights built into the governance structure that allow it to take certain actions. Once again, complex, and sometimes there can be an issue around weak governance of the subsidiary. But just trying to be realistic and paint an objective profile. Once again, these models and efforts depend on the unique circumstances of the effort. And we'll talk a little bit, a couple slides, later slides about how to really think about the design. We're putting forward a lot of permutations, but at the end of the day, these permutations are uh, examples of tools and mechanisms that can be used to achieve your specific goals uh, as a land trust. So I will wrap up the affiliation uh, model by talking about the case of a small land trust, the Hilltown, that formally affiliates with a larger statewide organization in Massachusetts. I believe it's the Trustees of the Reservation. And this affiliation gives Hilltown access to the incredible resources of the trustees around finance, fundraising, marketing, GIS mapping, and stewardship systems. In this case, from a governance perspective, Hilltown remains a separate legal entity, but it's relying on the larger entities' infrastructure. Yet at the same time, it's Hilltown is able to um, maintain its local board identity, and this arrangement allows Hilltown to professionalize its work, to scale its conservation efforts, yet manage its fiduciary risk by aligning with an established institution. So Hilltown retains its identity. It affiliates the affiliation operationally aligns and takes its capabilities up a notch. But the risk, if we step back, might be becoming overly dependent uh, on uh, the trustees. And the risk to the trustees is the potential for misconduct. Not likely to happen, but things, characteristics of which we should be cognizant. So with that, we conclude the kind of the landscaping of four key core collaboration archetypes, models, each with their associated variations as we drill down. And now we're going to move on to a fifth opportunity, which Aaron will discuss.
Thanks, Dan. And so, yeah, we thought making this presentation complete by kind of looking at the full range of collaborative opportunities and the full spectrum, it'd be important just to circle back to the sort of final and most permanent option on that spectrum, which are mergers and acquisitions. And so we often use the two interchangeably. There is a sort of legal distinction between the two, but we don't always use the legal mechanism to describe the actual process that happened between the two organizations. But just a quick overview here. Generally, when we're talking about mergers, we're talking about two or more organizations that combine into one organization and operate as that one organization going forward. The legal mechanism for this to happen is called a statutory merger. Generally, one of the organizations that's part of this merger is decided to be the surviving entity. They're able to carry forward their existing nonprofit status and IRS approval without having to create an entirely new nonprofit, although that's another option that um, can be pursued. The governance model here is that there's one board, there's one set of systems and policies. It is one organization that results from a merger. Sometimes the bylaws are created or amended during the merger process. In other cases, there might be one organization's bylaws that are sufficient to carry forward. So it really just depends on, yeah, what the organizations are bringing to the table and what they're interested in. The biggest risk here is that mergers and acquisitions are permanent. They can't be undone. It is possible to sort of walk back on some of the collaborative models that Dan discussed earlier, or to have sort of exit strategies built into a contractual arrangement or something like that. That is not possible with a merger. Once organizations merge, they have merged, and the only option out is to start an entirely new organization that would be doing the work of one of the previous organizations. Um, Because it's so permanent, this is a really important thing to ensure that there's cultural alignment between the organizations. And one of the big things we hear from land trusts as they're considering merger is the loss of local identity, although I specifically wrote this bullet as a perceived loss of local identity because I think we have seen some really creative ways to maintain that local identity through mergers that have happened, including things like creating town committees or town advisory boards that still operate at the local level and bring that local knowledge to the larger, perhaps regional organization. On the next column, we have acquisitions, very, very similar. The distinction being that generally one organization is sort of absorbed by another, and that other organization's identity is carried forward. Um, the legal mechanism here is a little bit different. Generally, it's done by dissolving one organization and then transferring all of the assets to that surviving entity. But again, the result is there's one board, there's one set of systems and policies, one identity for the organizations. The bylaws generally are carried forward from the surviving entity who is doing the absorbing, I guess. But again, risks very similar. It's permanent, can't be undone. You want to make sure that you have good cultural alignment between the organizations and yeah, taking steps to ensure that any sort of local community work and identity is carried forward through different structures within the organization. One of the things that we really want to highlight here is that compared with some of the joint ventures or the affiliations that Dan was discussing earlier in the presentation, mergers and acquisitions can actually be a lot more simpler because it's a sort of one-time, permanent, durable transaction. There isn't the need to either create a new subsidiary or to sort of sustain and nurture a joint affiliation or a joint venture rather. Those can often, as Dan talked about, sort of necessitate the creation of almost its own standalone entity that then also needs to be sustained the same way that the participating organizations do. And so if we're thinking about just the simplicity of any of these transactions and the durable and I guess need to or not so much need to work to sustain the agreement going forward. Mergers and acquisitions can certainly be a better option in those situations. Um, and also just worth noting, I mean, mergers are certainly becoming increasingly relevant as land trusts face different challenges like succession, capacity, stewardship. Annually, CLCC works on anywhere from 1 to 3 mergers or acquisitions with land trusts. And so it is an emerging trend. We're seeing more of these discussions happening and land trusts considering them more frequently, which leads me to my case study, which is really exciting. As of today, actually, you all are getting this fresh off the press. The Avalonia Land Conservancy has merged with the Colchester Land Trust and the Salem Land Trust. They've been working on this process for many months now. The merger is actually effective as of today, which is really exciting that we have this opportunity to share with you all. But sort of following our similar format from the earlier parts of this presentation, we wanted to again lay out sort of like why would this collaboration happen? I mean, these were 3 accredited land trusts. They were working in sort of geographically neighboring areas. They all had shared interests in sort of building their organizational capacity, hiring an executive director or other staff, and realized that that wasn't something that they could all do alone. And so coming together made sense, and they all had similar conservation values and priorities in terms of the lands that they wanted to protect through each of their organizations. Thinking back to the last slide, the governance structure, Avalonia is the surviving entity there. That's the one whose sort of nonprofit status is carried forward. But this was a statutory merger where all 3 of the organizations came together. There was some revision of the bylaws for Avalonia that ensured that there would be some representation from Salem and Colchester on the board. And then there's also some agreement where they are creating sort of town committees to retain and elevate the local knowledge and insights that the members of the Salem and Colchester Land Trust boards and their volunteers all had about their local community. And it absolutely makes sense because you don't want to lose that local knowledge through a merger process. some of the key risks and considerations that they had through that process was all three of them were accredited. And so we needed to ensure that whatever we did going forward wouldn't jeopardize that accreditation status. Fortunately, the Accreditation Commission is used to working with land trusts that have merged through the accreditation process. And it's just a matter of sort of communicating who's going to be the surviving entity and informing them along the way. Another key consideration was what happens to some of those land conservation projects that maybe have been years in the making, or you've been talking with that landowner for 10 or 20 years, just waiting for the right moment for them to decide to conserve their land. And again, that goes back to this uh, work to maintain that local connection, to retain local relationships and information, and make sure that that continues on with the new organization and isn't lost through the merger process. So really exciting. Congratulations to this group. Looking forward to seeing where they go from here, but it's a really exciting step in that region. And with that, Dan, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Aaron. So I think as this conversation has presentation has illustrated, there's no single best model for collaboration. The right structure depends on where the organization is, the goals, the timeline, uh, the effort that is being undertaken, and the level of integration that's going to be required to be successful, whatever the challenge or opportunity might be. Uh, I would add that there's some high-level considerations, and I've hit on these earlier, but I would just reemphasize that as services become more complex, um, as assets become more intangible, or as measurement and control enforcement become more difficult, there's a need for more structured governance. And this governance should align the interests of the collaborating parties through legal mechanisms and associated incentives. The example Aaron was giving about accreditation, um, if an accredited organization starts collaborating with a non-accredited organization, if there's some risk to that potential accreditation, reserve powers might be a way of mitigating that risk, but aligning those interests. And finally, the governance structure should minimize the costs of writing, monitoring, and enforcing the agreements that underlie the initiative. But with that said, regardless of the model, there's a couple of rules of thumb that should be adopted when developing collaboration, because it's all about the collaboration. It's not the organizational structure is a mechanism. It's a facilitator. So start with your goals, not the structure. Um, Build trust and communication because that just goes a long way. It reduces the friction. You see eye to eye, you're on the same page. Define decision rights clearly. Make sure there's no ambiguity in who decides what, and make sure there's clarity around resolving conflicts. Uh, and as I had said earlier, match the governance to the risk. If you're sharing risk, and that risk is hard to met, especially where it becomes even harder to measure, stronger governance and oversight are required. And then, once again, I think this echoes a point Aaron made, plan for change. Things may evolve. You need off-ramps, you need review points, and ways to adapt. Think of it as an ongoing process, a dance, where you ultimately achieve this collaboration that you're seeking, but just mitigate the risk. And I'll stop there, Aaron.
Thanks. So just to wrap things up, CLCC as your statewide service organization, how can we help? Um, we are happy to have conversations about anything that you heard or learned about today. We can help you think through these different collaborative models and figure out which one or ones might be most appropriate for your situation. Um, In Connecticut, we don't have a ton of examples of some of these, but we can certainly point to examples in either other states or in different sectors. We've done a fair amount of research into, or Dan has done a fair amount of research into some of those examples. So we're happy to share with those and connect you with peers if we have that contact. Um, we can help identify starting points, whether that just be facilitating a meeting between land trusts in a region or neighboring land trusts. That's what we do. And yeah, continuing to sort of frame the governance and operational questions. That gets back to Dan's point about starting out with what's the goal of what you're doing, not which of these models should we be doing. What are you trying to accomplish, and then we figure out what model might make the most sense. And yeah, we can help get you on the track of meeting with an attorney or financial professionals who will be necessary to actually implement some of these more advanced forms of collaboration. Um, we can provide a lot of that sort of technical assistance through our staff, and then if and when land trusts are willing to take the step to do mergers, we do have dedicated funding through the Peter and Carmen Lucia Buck Foundation and their Building Enduring Land Trusts program. So just a quick overview of how that works. Generally, land trusts are eligible for an implementation grant. So once both land trusts have passed a resolution to enter into a good faith attempt at merging, the foundation will support that merger and the implementation of that merger, any sort of legal or due diligence costs, with a grant of generally up to about $50,000, depending on the complexity of the merger. And then the same foundation pledges general operating support for multiple years after the merger has occurred to sort of catalyze the organization and perhaps help them hire their first executive director or something like that. So, any questions about that program, please don't hesitate to reach out. We can certainly talk more about the merger program as well as any of the opportunities that we saw presented today. Last but not least, I do want to just highlight that, again, this presentation was based off of a really extensive report that Dan did, and we have sort of a summary distilled version of that on our website and our resource library now. We'll be sure to follow up if you registered for our webinar today with the link to that, but the report itself has a number of other examples of how land trusts might use these different collaborative models. And yeah, just kind of gives you a nice written take home from today's presentation. So with that, we are happy to take any questions that you have. And I see we've got one. So let me just pull down the screen and we'll take those questions. How do we do this? Sorry, too many monitors here. All right, so Julie asked, have you seen community financial support change after a merger? For example, are donors less likely to donate to a regional organization because they want to keep their money local, or perhaps more likely to donate because the new larger organization is viewed as stronger? And follow that up with not just financial support, but also moral support. Great question, Julie. My experience, having worked on mergers over the past few years, has been the latter, that folks are more likely to donate because they see the organization taking a really thoughtful step forward in sort of succession planning and intent to grow and making themselves more sustainable. I think just about every membership vote that has needed to happen before a merger has been unanimous, meaning that the members are incredibly supportive of the organization taking this step to merge. And in most cases, we have seen land trusts be able to attract larger gifts from more donors. And in some cases, that includes land donors as well, who perhaps weren't comfortable donating their land to the smaller land trust that perhaps wasn't operating as effectively as it could be. But once they took that step to make the merger or to do the merger and make themselves a stronger organization, felt more comfortable conserving their land with that land trust. So yes, on both the financial and the transactional side. I don't know if I have a metric for moral support, but maybe that membership vote is a good indication for that as well. Any other questions that folks want to put into the chat? Going once, going twice. Well, again, we'll follow. Oh, here we go. Are there examples of land trusts collaborating on successor trustees? Not sure. Dan, do you know? Trying to think of what that. Julie, can you say a little bit more on that question? I think we have the opportunity to make you live so you can not have to type it. Let's see. Yes, I can allow you to talk if you're so interested.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. I hope you can't see me though.
No, we see a beautiful smile.
Okay.
Can't see you.
Um, so my question is about, so I'm with the Branford Land Trust. We're a strong organization. We don't foresee any problems, but we're realizing that there might be an opportunity to write into our, let's say, founding documents about what should happen if the Branford Land Trust ceases to exist, who assumes responsibility for
Mm.
ownership and management of the lands that we currently protect. So that's what I meant by a successor trustee. If you have any examples of land trusts that have come together to support each other in that way.
Yeah, so that's sort of like the backstop concept, like worst
Yep,
case scenario, where is your property going to go?
yep, exactly.
Um, I guess that would fall into the contractual bucket. I think so. The biggest part of this conversation, I think, where we have sometimes seen land trusts not think this through all the way is to make sure that there's a willing successor organization. And many land trusts have listed sort of large, either national or state organizations as successor organizations. And it has been the case that those organizations don't want to accept the properties that have been listed. And so we, through a recent merger, had to sort of go and undo some of that language and uh, allow the land to revert to a land trust that was willing to accept the property. Um, so I don't know if I have a great answer on this. I mean, I think it's all about building the relationships with the land
Yep.
trusts that might serve as a backstop for you. But again, I think it was one of Dan's sort of design principles there is that building in opportunities to change that. I mean, organizations ebb and flow and the priorities of organizations change. And so it may have been the case that 20 or 30 years ago, when land trusts were listing, for example, the Nature Conservancy as their backstop organization, the Nature Conservancy would have accepted those properties, but that tends not to be the case anymore. So it is something that kind of needs to be continually looked at and perhaps amended.
Right. I guess what I'm asking is, are there examples like in Connecticut of two or three land trusts having some kind of reciprocal arrangement in that regard without actually going through a formal merger? And maybe not. And maybe that's for a reason. Like maybe there's a better way to do that.
I will have to get back to you, Dan. I
Okay.
can't remember if we came
Well,
up.
nothing. I mean, wasn't necessarily an example I was looking for or that I encountered, but that's not to say that there wouldn't be examples out there of such an arrangement. And I think it's maybe something with just a little bit of digging we could uncover.
Mhm. Yeah, so we can follow up with you on that.
Great. Thank you.
One more question. Somebody asked, I'm curious about the framework for establishing the collaborative categories or buckets. How are those selected? I feel as though regional conservation partnerships were overlooked as their own unique category of collaboration. That was certainly not our intent. I think regional conservation partnerships just fall into one of those earlier portions of the spectrum. So, depending on the formality of a regional conservation partnership, it might be considered information sharing, just bringing organizations together to meet, share information, think through different challenges that they're experiencing. Some of the more sort of formal or structured regional conservation partnerships are there are contractual obligations or contractual agreements there. I think I mentioned some of them have partner agreements. So those are certainly viable options. For this presentation, we wanted to focus on some of the perhaps untapped or unused models that are perhaps also a little bit more complicated and land trusts don't necessarily have the same exposure to. So it's not that we are prioritizing one over the other. These are all really important mechanisms for land trusts to work with one another. We just focused our presentation on some of the things to the right of the spectrum. Dan, I don't know if you have anything to
No,
add.
I would concur. It was a means of, say, from an organizational governance collaborative structure to put forth some archetypes as descriptors and to characterize them rather than to preclude specific arrangements and arrangements, as you mentioned, that could fall into any number of the buckets depending on how they're executed.
All right. Any final questions? I haven't seen any new ones pop up. Well, if not, thank you all so much. Dan, thank you especially for all the work you've done researching this. It's been a real pleasure working with you and learning all of this. And it's more than we were able to research on our own. So having you come in and help us through the fellowship program, really, really supportive of this work. And I hope we'll be able to take some of these models and maybe implement them here in Connecticut with some of the folks in our audience or beyond. But thank you for presenting. We really appreciate it. Thank you for all your work on this report. And we will follow up with a copy of that report, which is also available on our website, as well as a recording if you'd like to share this with anybody on your board or within your organization. And tune in for more webinars with CLCC. We love having you here. And stay cool. It's going to be hot. So enjoy the long weekend. And thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.